Welcome everybody to episode 22 of the Pipala Show with guest host Dan Naples. Dan, how are you?
Well, I'm doing great. I'm here. I'm super happy Luke invited me. Actually been listening to his podcast, the show. So when he actually texted me, invited me, I was super excited. And yeah, I'm just happy to be here.
Yeah, man. I'm so happy that you could come on as soon as obviously we're doing this. Could you basically give a brief description about yourself, because you're a very interesting person.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, my name's Dan Naples. I've worked on different Democratic Party campaigns in Northeast Ohio since 2018. Many hours, especially in the 2020 campaign season, from the Biden campaign to local races for judges, at least progressive liberal judges, since they're usually not partisan races. I've been involved with different philanthropies in the Youngstown area. I've been involved with just bunches of different organizations across the board, whether it's political, non-political, through the university. I study business economics at my school, so I think that's kind of everything to start.
You also said you were the president of...
College Democrat, yeah. I was the president of the College Democrats at Youngstown State University from the fall semester of 2019 to the fall semester of this past year, 2021. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So you're a pretty distinguished individual.
I mean, I don't want to brag, but if you want to describe me as that, yeah, sure.
Yeah. Well, like I said before, obviously we're talking about this. You're one of the only qualified people really to talk about politics or that kind of realm of conversation in general. So I'm really excited to have you on. Thank you once again for coming on. This is awesome.
Happy to be here. Yeah.
So we were talking about beforehand. What really got you interested in politics?
Oh, wow. So, honestly, what got me interested in politics was just kind of a general curiosity that evolved into... So it started out just as a general interest in high school. Mm-hmm. But as I kind of came into college, what started my activism and really wanted to be involved was I personally saw in either my own life, starting with an issue I had with an insurance company for healthcare costs, to other issues with people I was close with or people I wasn't even really close with, but I knew were affected by political structures in our society, and I felt it wasn't right. I'm like, well, I have some means, at least, to what I can do to make a change, so I may as well throw my hat and do what I can.
That's pretty cool. It's healthcare, especially now. Healthcare is super expensive for everything. I feel like, even something as simple as dental. It's crazy. And a lot of people don't even have health insurance in this country.
Yeah, no, healthcare costs are ridiculous in this country. Especially compared to the rest of the developed world. About a quarter of all healthcare costs in the United States, comparatively to Canada, a quarter of all the costs for the whole nation are for paperwork. Clerical work. From the bills you get in the mail to someone pushing paper, a quarter of those costs are for that.
Literally for printing.
Yes.
Paper.
Yeah, printing paper, having someone just sign or reprint or type up something of bills.
Really?
Billing, yes.
That's so surprising, because you think the United States of America, you think there would be some technological way that we could do this with an e-signature online, something like that, but
yeah, the lawyer costs and everything associated with clerical fees takes up a quarter of that cost. And in the United States, we pay more for healthcare out of the top 30 countries in the world.
Yeah, I saw that stat on Twitter a couple weeks ago, and the medical industry alone is really a business. It's not really there to help the people.
Yeah, it is a business. Doctors work for insurance companies, not really hospitals. This isn't to put down nurses or doctors.
No, not at all.
It's just kind of how our system is structured. It's made for profit.
Mm-hmm. And it's crazy. I was watching this comedy special. I forget the comedian, but he was talking about how all these hospitals have this lump sum of money they just sit on essentially for, I don't even know why. I'm not sure.
They sit on it. So a lot of hospitals will sit on money, actually, very interestingly, in a similar way, universities sit on money to pay for different costs. Well, that's for like low income individuals is what's supposed to be used. But since a lot of these hospitals are private and for profit, a good way for these companies is they keep that money and they try not to give it out to low income individuals. So when you have that pile of cash, they can't really take it for profit or anything, but what they can do is they use it for when there's issues in their cash flow as a business. So if they have a month that's not doing so good, they just take money, put it in till maybe next month, okay, they can make higher profits on something and just plug it back into that fund. Yeah.
I mean, obviously some people will feel different about that, but I don't think that's necessarily right. When you have, like you said, when you have people like the low income individuals and not giving them that money, even though that's what it was designed for, I mean, it kind of makes you rethink everything. Like how many other institutions are like this in the United States, where like they're taking advantage of the system for their own personal gain.
No, exactly, and at least for healthcare, it's when people talk about like nationalized healthcare or single payer healthcare, the first thing is like, oh, well, doctors won't make as much. Well, the thing is, within our current system, a lot of that money, like doctors get paid a lot, and they should. Doctors and nurses, they do wonderful things, especially after COVID. I mean, I think we all saw how important the healthcare industry is for our country.
Very.
But a lot of the money is not going to them. A lot of that money is going to the business side, like business people, the insurance companies, the hospital, the people who own and run hospitals on a business end. They're getting those lump sums of money. Well, doctors, yes, they are making a good amount of money. Nurses are making a good amount of money, but they're not seeing really that big share of the pie, and it's coming out of people like you, me, just everyone watching our pockets.
It's crazy, bro. Like, I was talking to, I forget who it was. It wasn't on the podcast, but it was like a lot of, I remember talking about, who was it? It was this one mom of a friend, and I heard from my mom who was talking to her, like she had to go back to school. She already had a 4-year bachelor's degree, but she had to go back to school for a master's, even though she already had all the experience needed to get the higher paying job. It was like, I don't understand,
Yeah, I mean, education structures in the country too are very odd. Especially costs. I mean, like college in the United States, we do have it in a semi-subsidized way.
What do you mean by that?
So, for anyone who's been to college, we all know FAFSA, which is basically a way that gives access to credit lines for higher education. The problem being, up until I believe it was 2011, 2012, there were really good regulations on private entities giving those credit lines out to college students. So what that meant was they could charge exorbitantly high interest rates and still have it be protected. And what I mean by protected, that meant that debt cannot be taken away even in bankruptcy. That's the only debt in the U.S.
It's crazy. I knew that too. It's nuts.
So private banks and private industry or private credit lines would just loan out money kind of willy-nilly, knowing we can get a whole lot of money on interest and not really worry about getting the principal back, because you'll have someone paying back tiny bits of money for the rest of their life.
It's crazy. I feel like, in terms of like the overall worth of a degree, I feel like a degree is still, worth a lot in this country, but nowhere near as much as it was, in my opinion. I mean, we could go back and forth about this, but what do you feel about that? What do you think about that?
I kind of feel on the contrary. From studying in econ, the average earner from having just some college, not a degree or an associate, just some college versus a 4-year bachelor's, the difference in lifetime earnings is about $1 to $2.5 million.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because I mean, education, all it is it's a negotiating tool for your labor. You don't actually have to really do a different job. A good example, I guess, would be in having an MBA versus a just normal bachelor's. You can do the same job as someone who has an MBA and be in the exact same career field, But that person who has an MBA gets to go up to their boss, their director, whoever, and say, I have an MBA. I have all these qualifications. I spent X amount of money that's invested into my labor before you. I need more money because my labor is more expensive than this other person's who has just a bachelor's degree. And at the end of the day, that's really all kind of education is my labor is more valuable to whoever you're going to sell your labor to.
Huh. That's an interesting, like, kind of construct of, like, what a degree really is. I never really thought about it like that. You see, it's always, like, kind of like the dumb way of thinking, in my opinion. We're never going to learn about, or we're never going to do this, say, I don't know, history of rock and roll. I had that class. We're never going to have history of rock and roll in our professions if we're business majors, for example. So why do we have to take these pointless electives? I always viewed... I'm not a fan of that. I think that we should have, in my opinion, more of like... kind of like get straight to the point form of like education where you're going to like learn about stuff that you're going to do in your job.
Oh yeah, I definitely think there is critiques for the current college system. However, there does, I think, for all education, we need to have like a well-rounded curriculum, which I think sort of courses like that offer, especially to an individual like myself, like taking the history of film cinema or whatever. Like, I wouldn't have taken an art class in college if I didn't have to, but since I did have to, I learned a lot about film cinema. I learned a lot about old movies, and there's a greater appreciation for arts because of that. And I do see the kind of need we have for that, but also see that as a big barrier of entry, because the more classes you have to take, the more expensive it is, especially for low-income individuals who will have to work their way through college. That puts another barrier. But yeah, no, it's kind of a balancing act between you have the want to have a well-rounded education. So in a perfect world, everybody kind of learns everything, but we're not in a perfect world. So you can't have everyone be an astrophysicist and also a ballet teacher. So we're kind of having these, okay, so you're going to take so many art classes, you're going to take so many STEM classes regardless of major, but at what point is that a hindrance to individuals to get a job, get an education to get a job? Because in our society, at least how it's structured, is education is based around what kind of labor we're going to produce at the end of the day. And there's, even for low-paying jobs, regardless of what it is, we all there's always kind of a value we have to place on that. And I guess that's something, at least personally, I consider like a market failure. So take, for example, historians. Historians oftentimes, are very underpaid. Egyptology, for example. Learning and knowing about ancient Egypt. I think that's something, it's one of the greatest, earliest civilizations of mankind, of knowing about this. However, they're not paid a lot.
I had no clue.
Yeah, no. I mean, even sociology, for example. Sociology, psychology, with just bachelors can be, very low wage. But I mean, I think especially with the mental health care in this country right now, the amount of money it takes to actually become a psychologist, psychiatrist, a counselor, to actually help people is very low because, well, a lot of people aren't spending money on it. But people need access to it. But at the current prices and what people need to pay in consideration with the degree, people aren't getting access to services, but also people with those degrees are not getting access to the labor. So that is kind of what you can consider, in my opinion, a market failure, is because there's services that are needed and services that are demanded, but no one's actually really able to get it through a market system.
It's one of the many tragedies in our country today.
Oh yeah, no, and I think that's, I guess, in a long scope of things where like government subsidization, government involvement, not have government involved in everything, but government intervention and saying, all right, we're going to subsidize healthcare or mental health or Egyptology, whatever it is that society wants to value and say, hey, this is something that's good for society, even if it's not necessarily traditionally profitable.
Yeah. That's something I agree with you on. I don't think having big government ever leads to anything really good. I think small government for like the basic stuff. So regulation of roads, buildings being constructed, bridges, anything really at that level. I'm on board with. But when it comes to there's a lot of crooked politicians in Washington, obviously, who they're there not for the people, but for a paycheck for themselves. Whether it's insider trading or lobbyists paying them to vote one way, even though they literally ran on voting another way, stuff like that, it bothers me. Now, we're obviously much better off than majority of the countries out there. We're obviously still one of the best, but that doesn't mean there's not problems here. What would you think about that?
Woodrow Wilson said it best, that America needs to be the shining house on the hill. That America in like the new world, as a sense, like at one point we were leading the way in what many would consider like progressivism. America was one of the first countries that said, we're going to offer K through 12 education free of charge. Well, not free of charge, but through taxes. Like you will, regardless of how much your parents make, you're going to have access to education. We're going to have workers' rights, Social Security. America was like leaders in the world for a lot of these things. And we've kind of taken the back seat to Europe and even many Asian nations, especially like South Korea, Japan, Singapore, and different things like that, where I think we have too much of a focus on not individual liberty in the sense of what people can do, but specifically on how much people are making. And that sounds really, really weird to say, like, oh, like how letting people have more money. However, in an economy, how much people have isn't always the same as how much value that is worth for what people have. Take for example back in the 1950s to 1960s, that was like considered like the golden age for, especially in the Midwest, manufacturing. We had the highest tax rates in the developed world. The United States was actually catching up to the Soviet Union at that time because, surprisingly, the U.S. was behind the Soviet Union in production capabilities and standards of living across the board. And it wasn't until a lot of investments in the Kennedy administration, the Johnson administration, and even the Eisenhower administration, from these taxes, we had many public works. I mean, the highway system is probably one of the best examples of public works in the country next to the New Deal. And that came from higher tax periods. So yeah, people didn't, on paper, have the same amount as money because of higher taxes, but the standard of living, the cost of goods, everything was much better because of that. I mean, we can even see that today with inflation. A lot of people are saying, oh, we need, like in Florida and California, they gave debit cards out for gas or different things. So people like, oh, well, this is going to help families pay for things. And in the short run, yeah, it will. But in all actuality, what is inflation? It's we don't have as much stuff, but there's a higher demand. So when you give people more money, you're just boosting that demand. So in the long run, you're going to have an issue with inflation. So if, as of today for the recording, we had the raise in Fed interest rates, so that's reducing the amount of money in the economy to kind of curb that. And the other way you do that is very paradoxically raising taxes to actually improve it so that people have more value but less money.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah,
it's crazy. We talked about this on a previous podcast. 80% of the cash in circulation has just been printed over the past 2 years.
Yeah.
It's nuts, bro. How do you think that, we come out of this inflation crisis? Do you think we'll take that route or?
Yeah, I mean, this is nothing the Federal Reserve hasn't seen, especially, it's not even as bad as inflationary rate is rough for the 70s, but we do not have stagflation. So a big thing is if we had stagflation, that would mean the economy is not doing good and we have inflation. Everything else considered besides inflation, things are pretty good. We have a relatively low unemployment rate. We have a high job growth rate. Manufacturing is doing good in the United States. The stock market was doing good before, I think, a correction that started in February. But even now, the market is kind of leveled out. Everything we're kind of seeing is we have inflation, which is hurting demand, but wages, for the first time in a while, have slightly grown for Americans. We've had continued job growth. Even oil production in the United States has grown It's been on the same track since the Trump administration through the Biden administration. We haven't really seen much stuff other than inflation growth, which do cause concern and isn't good. But that's not as bad as in the 70s when the economy was going down, we were producing less oil, and also inflation is going up.
You mentioned a couple of seconds ago how oil production in the United States is still on par with the Trump administration. I guess what I want to ask is, why do you think that particularly the right-wing media wants to keep talking about how Biden supposedly shut down oil production in the United States?
So the basis for that comes from Biden administration back in, I want to say, March or April, first 100 days of his presidency, banning new gas drillings on federal land. On paper, for progressives, that sounds really good, and for the right-wing media, that sounds really bad. Until you understand the fact that oil companies have enough already permits and stuff, pre-bought leases on federal land for gas drilling. And keep in mind, this is only public land. This isn't even considering private land. They have enough to keep drilling, keep the production levels the same for federal land and public land for the next 30 years already.
Wow.
They have no issue with that. The only issue came was when the Biden administration actually said, hey, we're going to look into, can you really have these leases? They really curbed that down after oil prices started to go up. Why I think the media really, specifically usually like right-wing media, focuses on it is, one, everyone can relate to a gas price. Majority of Americans drive, or they know someone who's driving and are relying on that. Second, gas prices and oil prices directly relate to how efficient an economy is running because everything requires energy to make. So that can in turn raise prices eventually, layered down a supply chain. And third, it's worked before. Specifically in the Obama administration was when the kind of like the first time that Fox News and the different right-wing medias kind of tried this, was trying to say gas prices or anything like that, blame it on the administration or whoever you need, even if you can't really make a good argument for it. Just keep repeating it in the media. It's not even just Republicans in the right-wing media are guilty of this, or even just in the political sphere. This is just a kind of a marketing tactic that you really even see. A good example is even Coca-Cola, I will say. When's the last time you saw a ad of someone saying, of Coca-Cola advertising saying specifically to drink Coke? Like,
to be honest, the only thing you could remotely, in my experience, is at the movies. But then again, that's not by Coke. It's a student film from a particular college.
But so when you see a Coca-Cola product,
it's the brand.
It's just people being happy. It's people smiling.
Yeah.
You're not actually selling people. No one's gonna buy it if I said, "Hey, buy Coca-Cola." Coke sponsor Luke Pipala.
Wouldn't that be awesome?
Yeah. But they want to associate a feeling or idea with something else. So in the terms of politics, right-wing media, what they're doing is they're saying high gas prices. They just want in your head to think high gas prices equal Biden or Democrats or Obama or whatever. The same way they did with critical race theory last year. Critical race theory, Obama, Democrats, Biden, Clinton, whatever. That's kind of just really, it's a marketing tactic at the end of the day. That's really all it is.
Going to critical race theory, I'm glad you brought that up, because throughout that whole 6-month period that they were talking about that, I was really confused, because on one hand, I don't want it to be taught in schools that one race is, valued higher than the other. But at the same time, I want history to be taught how it happened. I don't want people to change history. So I guess what I'm asking is, what is critical race theory, or whatever they're calling it?
Yeah, no. So critical race theory, it's actually pretty simple. It's the idea of intersectionality, that in the United States there have been forces, whether it's economic, political, or sociological, that have had impacts on that white power in ways has manifested in, whether through economic action, political, or sociological, to cause issues to other races. That's it.
Huh.
So segregation.
Yeah.
Segregation falls specifically in that, or redlining. For example, slavery that's what it's saying is these things are kind of connected. Mm-hmm. It's not saying white people are at fault. It's kind of saying, hey, the idea of racism in itself, not as, it's a thing for white people at fault, but it as an idea has gone ingrained into certain sections of our society, and that while it's not necessarily someone's fault, that still exists, and we should try and work towards ending it. That was kind of the base argument against ending segregation, slavery, redlining, voter discrimination, a lot of those things.
Is gentrification in that too, or no? What would you say?
Personally, gentrification I do not see actually as big of a deal, because I believe it was through the Urban Housing Policy Institute, I can't remember who, said that when in areas of gentrification, when it occurs, that only really 7% of people actually end up moving out or losing their homes, and that really what just happens is there's either more jobs in an area, nicer, higher property values, things of that nature. There is always a concern of you don't want to push people out of where they've historically lived. I mean, that's always a concern. You want to have wealth for areas that maybe haven't in the past been able to share in that same big pot of the pie that we all have. Yeah.
Because historically, or maybe not even historically, just going off pop culture reference and stuff like that, it would appear from all that media and whatnot that it's much more than 7%.
I mean, yeah, that's kind of how it gets presented, but like when we're talking about like huge boroughs in New York, for example, like those neighborhoods are culturally are not changing.
That's good.
Look at like Little Italy in New York, that is not changing. The African American population, the Bronx, Brooklyn, those areas, Harlem, yeah, those areas are staying. Yet we're seeing gentrification in those areas, which really is in like a new wave of economic activity, because we're seeing a lot more Gen Z actually moving into the cities.
Yeah,
because people left the cities because of white flight, because there was a stronger urge of Caucasian Americans back then to want to have, I believe it was de jure segregation, where it was by choice, not by law. But as kind of people like our generation and the generation before us, like we went to school with black kids, Mexican kids, Asian kids, we realized like, listen, everyone's like, we're all human.
Yeah.
Like we don't need to have this separation.
Yeah.
Gen Z in specific is kind of like, well, we don't care. We want to be close to our jobs. We want to reduce our costs because of seeing the Great Recession, the COVID recession, .com crash, all this stuff, but wanting that financial security and being close to a job. Oh, excuse me.
It's all good. It's all good.
Love B-dubs. I have right for you. But yeah, no, like seeing that also coupled with, being close to a job, not having to pay for a car, at times like more green living in cities, you can say at certain points, depending on the city. Having that mixed with also, now you have urban communities that are predominantly a minority group, it opens up that doorway now of, now we're actually having different racial groups mix in what seems to be a positive light. Now there are negatives, and at times there is going to be people moving out of neighborhoods, there's going to be income clashes. That's going to happen. However, the trade-off is we're going to have better development in areas that were predominantly underdevelopment because of whether it was redlining from back in the 80s or people just not wanting to invest because they had some form of discriminatory bias. It really is just kind of a trade-off between those. Yeah.
I gotcha.
Yeah.
It's still filming, right?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I had a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned redlining, and I've always had a decent idea of what redlining is. Basically, from my understanding, it prevents certain backgrounds or minority groups from purchasing a home in, say, a white neighborhood. Is that all it is, or could you expand upon that?
Yeah, so the actual, just to kind of touch on it, you hit it pretty well, but redlining itself came from, I can't remember the name of the bank, I won't bring it up now, but it actually came from them by street taking a red marker and saying, They looked at the demographics and drew lines because they said, we want white people living with white people and black people living with black people, but the banks still wanted to make money off of loans to African Americans, specifically in the South. And they wanted to keep African Americans undereducated. They didn't want them to have the same resources, the same way they had under Jim Crow. So, just, I guess to answer your question, how do we fund public schools in the U.S.? Property taxes.
I was going to say taxes. So
property taxes in specific. So if you give lower mortgages, less expensive, like crappier housing basically, to a certain group, that means that property value is lower. That means there's not as much tax money going to a public school. Versus as if you have higher property values paying for another school, yeah, on paper it's supposed to be equal, but now you just put one group into a crappier property area versus one with better. The one with a better school is generationally going to have a better education, which circles back in my original point. The better education you have, the more valuable your labor is, the more money you get to make.
Yeah. Creates
that cycle. So that's really what redlining was basically a two-step form of segregation that the corporate America kind of put in place for specifically the South.
I feel like corporate America historically has been like the originator of like a lot of bad things.
Yeah.
Specifically around here, I don't know if it was intentional or not, if they knew that moving all these corporations in the Midwest, moving all these corporations, like the factories, production, everything, manufacturing overseas, I don't know if they knew that it was going to affect the U.S. like they did. You look at a city like Detroit, like all the stuff was made, all the cars were made in Detroit. And then one day they just said, okay, well, we can make so much more of a profit if we go to like a China or a Mexico or somewhere like that. And then just all of these trends, they just keep happening. Where do you think that stems from? Where do you think that started?
It's profit. Like, these companies know what's going to happen. They don't care. A company's sole goal is to make money. Like, regardless of what the company is, what they want to say. The sole... Milton Friedman proposed the dominant model for business, which is that the only stakeholders who matter are the shareholders for a business. And that's been the dominant model since I want to say the 1970s for pretty much all business practices. However, an important note to that the business community likes to ignore is anything that a corporation should not do, the government should just regulate and tell them, hey, you can't do that. Do this. This is the rule. Specifically bringing up like environmental regulations was a big example. Again, Milton Friedman, who's like the godfather for libertarian economic free thought, he was bringing that up of like, if we're going to have this system ethically, this is how it should be. And kind of personally on a note, for manufacturing for the U.S., I think there should be ways and preventions that like, I think a big thing for manufacturing, especially in this area, and the 2016 Trump campaign with immigration was kind of the South Park meme of they're stealing our jobs. Well, no Mexican stole your job. The reason there's not a factory here isn't because someone in Mexico needed one. The reason there's not a factory here in the Midwest is because a greedy corporation wanted more profit and they decided to move it there. Not because someone else needed a job and they're willing to work for less.
Yeah. And I feel like capitalism, it's still the best in my opinion, like system. It's brought a lot of people out of poverty. But there's pros and cons of everything. And like you said before, it motivates all these businesses to make a profit no matter what. So naturally, of course, this is a con. They're going to move all this production, manufacturing over to places where they don't have to pay workers as much. And you see it in the quality of stuff sometimes, but it's one of the true disservices that they've done to this country.
No, and I mean, no one really disagrees, I think, that capitalism, even Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto, he wrote, capitalism is the best system we have had up until this point. And that's
really?
Yeah, no, everyone kind of likes to knock on Marx as like this evil kind of like, oh, capitalism is no, he brought up and said like, hey, capitalism is right now it's fantastic to what we had before, because beforehand he noted that it was feudalism beforehand, which was kind of like just neo-slavery. But his critiques of capitalism in ways that he wanted socialism to kind of transfer, we've actually seen a lot already in the United States, surprisingly. There was like 8 tenets, and one of them is a social security system. So literally like a pension for old people. Mm-hmm. That's one of them. K through 12 education, a nationalized healthcare system, so like sort of Medicare. Different safety nets were really his main proposal in the manifesto itself. You had other philosophers who wanted other things, and because there's like different flavors, I guess, of socialism you want to bring up. Mm-hmm. Like the Soviet style, terrible. Like no one agrees that authoritarianism is good. Oh yeah, no. I mean, Karl Marx is the first like economic philosophers. Him and Adam Smith, like they're some of the first. They were like the first to really think about it and say, like, oh, this is capitalism, this is socialism, this is X, Y, and Z. Yeah. I mean, even like Milton Friedman, Hayek, all these philosophers. Or philosophers, I should say. Well, they're philosophers, but economists mainly. They're referencing each other, just like how Plato and Aristotle, they're referencing each other, they're talking about each other. The same thing happens with economists, whether they're agreeing or disagreeing, whether it's free market, more socialist philosophies, or even just government intervening, kind of like John Maynard Keynes, who kind of founded the modern idea for items being sticky in an economy.
What does that mean?
So before Keynes, who was a British economist, the idea was that markets are just going to always... They're moving at the same kind of pace. One's going to react to the other, and it's going to have relatively at the same time they're going to react to each other. Well, when the Great Depression happened, we saw... pretty much productions, everything's falling, everything's kind of out of whack. Mm-hmm. But also we saw, hey, okay, so the economy's starting to slowly come back during the Depression. Wages were not growing, though. And Keynes kind of came back and said, okay, so profits can grow, there's a little bit of economic growth, wages aren't growing. Which, beforehand, it was always, oh, well, if things are becoming more efficient, the economy's growing, wages should grow. Mm-hmm. Keynes saw this and said, no, they don't adjust at the same rate. They're sticky, which means that they're going much more slowly, and then you're not going to see any benefits from the inverse of that happening. And so when wages aren't growing, that means your economy really isn't growing. The buying power for consumers, all the benefits of efficiency in an economy really aren't occurring. So a good example would be, to kind of explain this, let's say, we use Coke for example, right? Let's say you and me, we're the economy. Mm-hmm. And right now, we are buying, 2 cans of Coke. That's the GDP for the year, and that's $100. Both are $50. Microphone is the government, let's say, and however they get money, they have some money. All right, so we have, for whatever reason, an economic downturn now, whether it's I'm worried about the price of Coke, maybe you don't want to drink as much Coke, whatever. So now we only have, let's say, 1 can of Coke in the economy. Well, whether it's you or me, I'm not either buying as much Coke, and more than likely you're not selling as much. Mm-hmm. Well, this sucks for kind of both of us. Mm-hmm. So Keynes's idea was, all right, even if over time it's going to slowly get back that I'm going to put the Coca-Cola back into our rotation, we're not going to see those benefits. Mm-hmm. So what the government can do is, let's say this is like government stimulus. In the meantime, the government comes in from taxes and says, we're going to inject this here, and that's going to keep the circular motion to keep going. It's going to juice the economy almost like you would a car. Huh. You're going to jumpstart an economy. That's pretty much what he argued, and it worked pretty well for about 40 years, up until 1970 stagflation. Because then we saw as we kept spending money through social programs, it then ran out. We had stagflation, and that kind of brought on like the Reaganomics era, which now we're kind of seeing, okay, Reaganomics isn't working out because now we're not seeing wages grow anymore. We really haven't seen wages grow since the 80s, but we're not seeing that same kind of stability that it brought back from the 80s.
When you say Reaganomics, you mean the top-down?
Yeah, so Reaganomics is a lot different than what people are going to associate from like Milton Friedman, I guess like libertarian economics. So Milton Friedman, who directly advised President Reagan back in the 80s, said, look, if you want to have the economy do better, lower taxes, lower spending on net. Lower intervention, lower tariffs, lower everything. You just need to have the market be as open as possible. Specifically, you should get rid of subsidization. That means don't subsidize big industries, lower their taxes, don't bail people out, don't spend less on the military. Like, Friedman was for open borders, for all these really kind of, what some people might say is like left-wing things.
Yeah.
And Reagan kind of took and was like, well, I'm going to subsidize big businesses. I'm going to lower taxes just for everyone, which, yeah, that was in part for it. Just cut welfare, but expand the military, which that doesn't do anything. When you're increasing spending, regardless in the government, whether it's military or on social spending, you're not hitting the point that was made of like just lower spending and let private markets handle it. Which was a big thing that the Reagan administration, something I disagree with his administration did, was kind of jumpstart like the neo-military industrial complex that President Eisenhower even warned us about.
Yeah, you see the video on YouTube. You could watch it. It's like, 3 minutes?
Yeah, just it breaks it down like really well. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's I can't remember even who made it, but like it just shows like, oh, you start a war here and this company with this. I mean, if you've seen Vice,
I haven't. I need to.
That is such a good movie, and it makes you hate Dick Cheney for every reason, and it is very worth watching still, because even Republicans I've seen are like, man, fuck Dick Cheney after watching that movie, because there's even a quote from him at the end of the movie, and you just kind of like love to hate him, but not like it's like he looks into the camera and is like, I'm not going to apologize for a single thing I did to keep your family safe, right after seeing about how like he basically lied to President Bush and like top generals about about Iraq, because the only connection he had in the Iraq for Iraq and Al Qaeda was a single guy who may have met with Osama bin Laden. He was like, imagine like if you had a petty drug dealer in Youngstown and he met and like you thought he was in the same city as Pablo Escobar and said that they were like business partners when really they just were doing blow in Miami at two different clubs. That basically was the connection. He was like, no, these guys are super connected. And that's what he brought as evidence to the UN Security Council.
Boy.
And that kickstarted the war in Iraq.
How many people, how many soldiers died because of that decision?
God, like, I think between the wars in the Middle East, I think it's like 5,000 to 7,000. But like, I'm not knocking like U.S. military deaths on this, but we're talking like around over 500,000 civilians in these countries died.
Are you serious?
Oh yeah, like again, I'm not trying to knock military deaths, but we don't talk about like a lot of civilians died from the bombings that happened from just the war in general. That it doesn't get talked about. Like talking about the destabilization of these economies, like all the different stuff that happens. And it's not to agree with a lot of these terrorists, but when you come in, like. Take, for example, if you were a kid our age and you grew up in these countries like right now, right? You see a bunch of guys with the American flag and they kind of blow up the place you're living at. They kill some family members and stuff. Like, yeah, you're going to grow up hating these people. You're going to hate their fucking guts. You don't know why they're here. You you want to like just live your life. They're forcing democracy. They're forcing all these things that people and civilizations need to come to their own realization to want.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like no surprise, like, oh, now the Taliban's back. It's like, of course the Taliban's back. Like, we've done nothing but hurt these people basically for all these years. And it's like the one group that has sort of stability and a sort of relation to the old way of life. Yeah, they're the only ones who's going to come back to power. The Taliban's bad. But keeping everything in context, it kind of makes sense.
Yeah. And when you think about it, it doesn't really make much sense that we went over there, or they went over there rather, to install like a democracy, kind of like we have right now.
Mm-hmm.
But like as soon as everybody pulled out, obviously you saw what happened.
Mm-hmm.
It's tragic. And then also thinking about it from everybody else's perspective that's not a U.S. citizen, like, are we looked at it the same as like we view Russia, China, North Korea? Like, that's a serious question.
Yeah, like, I don't think we're viewed... See, America is the world police.
Mm-hmm.
We have done not so great things around the world. However, on net, we are better than if it's China or Russia. Solely because at least we know, like, even if we are solely looking at our own best interests as the United States, and this is very paradoxical to what I just said, at least we're putting in, like, a capitalist system
Mm-hmm.
that allows countries to kind of begin their own business, to jumpstart their own economies, where you see with China in Africa right now, China's basically instituting neocolonialism, where they will loan certain African nations. Sorry if you want this to be on TikTok. Yeah, we're really talking bad about China.
It's okay.
Yeah.
We're not fans of TikTok here.
Yeah.
I mean, we have a TikTok, but you know, we don't really use it that much. It's all good.
They do this thing called debt trapping to a lot of
Okay.
countries, and it's where they will loan like 2 to 3 times their GDP annually to a lot of these African countries that don't have a lot of money to build infrastructure. And now these countries are indebted to China, and they have to make so much, like, they'll put, like, maybe military intelligence or kind of whatever China kind of wants in Africa, resource rights, whatever it is, to try and pay back. And we're talking about these countries that kind of been beaten up from colonialism. They're not doing well because they don't have stability. They didn't have really any guidance. Some of them have, like a lot of French colonies got a lot of guidance, surprisingly, from France. But a lot of countries with instability, they're looking for foreign investors, and China's like, hey, you know, we went through the same thing, here's some money, but then they debt trap. They're locking them in, and now it's like China's taking their resources, they're using them for cheap labor, they're using them for military intelligence, they're giving politicians scholarships to have them be more aligned in the UN Security Council or UN votes. It's a very elaborate scheme for China to just grow its influence into what's going to be the next big emerging markets, which is many African nations.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Everybody, that's the big three. Nobody really feels threatened by the Middle East, I would say, in terms of like world domination. Mm-hmm. But the big three has always been North Korea, Russia, and China. But out of the three, I only fear China because they not only have the nuclear power, but they have the influence. If they have this growing society where it's like this pseudo capitalism and socialism, where like it works somehow. And they're becoming more and more powerful, at least on
paper.
On paper, yeah.
Well, the number one thing for anyone who's worried about China overtaking the U.S., their net GDP on paper is going to overtake the U.S. if it already hasn't. However, looking at GDP per capita, the United States is averaging around anywhere, depending on what you're looking, 40 to 60 grand per capita. Mm-hmm. China is at 10K per capita. Yes, remember, China is huge. And a big thing that drives economic growth is population growth. China's population growth is stagnating. It's like flattening out because of the one-child policy.
Mm-hmm. Is that still in effect?
No, it ended. It's.
I thought it was 2013.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I can't remember what the exact rules are, but they've loosened it greatly. And it was really only enforced within cities. Like, again, China is really big. Like, imagine like enforcing every single law in the middle of the plains of the U.S. Like, so many laws are not just flat out not enforced there, or you call the police and you're in the middle of Iowa. Like, you call 911, no one's showing up for over an hour.
Yeah.
Like, depending on where you're at. Imagine that for China, but they don't have the same infrastructure, telephone lines, any of this stuff. Like, on top of areas being like semi-autonomous, like Nepal or just different areas that aren't as connected to what traditionally we see as China, especially to the far east, closer to like Russian territories.
Huh. Yeah. That's interesting though. Only 10K.
Yeah, like it's like 10 to 20, like give or take in that range, just solely because depending on how you're measuring GDP. But it's a lot lower than what the United States has. On top of the quality of life and different protections that like people have there, like I'm not even just talking like in social liberties, like people, yeah, they have their own place, but they're much smaller apartments, where when people have places here, they're houses or they're larger scale apartments, or people are doing work on their own. They're like being able to be much more self-sufficient and independent. And there's added value in that we don't usually account for, whereas in China, culturally, that's not occurring. Home Depot is a great example, because Home Depot, they didn't fail, but they did not do as well in China. Because what happens if, let's say you break a window in your house, right? Okay. The first thing you're going to do probably is you're going to watch out and fix it yourself, right? In China, with their growing middle class and their just cultural way of doing things, it's better to just pay someone to do that.
I see. First. And Home Depot is
fix it yourself.
Yeah.
So that's a way of like, well, you're not saving that money to spend. If I just, went to Home Depot and fixed the window myself, well, I can spend that money on something else. Whereas if you're spending your money much more on services that aren't necessarily necessary, you kind of see like, where is that money being spent? Is it really being value added into the economy versus just being spent?
I see what you're saying. That's interesting. So you see their middle class. Obviously, they're growing more luxuries. Huh. What are your thoughts on the whole Taiwan situation?
Taiwan, I guess, what do you mean for like Taiwan situation?
So President Biden said that they want to defend Taiwan, obviously, because there's so many chips being made there, if that's correct, against the Chinese invasion. What are your thoughts on that? Because I'm kind of torn. I don't like when we get involved in conflicts with other countries, but at the same time, we are, kind of like you said, the moral authority of the world, or the police of the world.
So, historical perspective is the official title for Taiwan is the Republic of China. So Taiwan became a government because back in 1949, that is where the last of the nationalist government during the Chinese Civil War fled. And they were backed by the United States. And they were able to be self-sustained, sort of like South Korea and Japan were, because of the United States. These like countries, these democracies that are doing really well economically and are kind of beacons against authoritarianism around the world, are there because of our intervention. And Taiwan, and specifically, it's a threat to China because it's right off the coast, and it's saying, look, we're here, we exist, we're free, we're happier here. Our way of doing things is better, to kind of like it's not even Western, it's like democracy and capitalism made for Asia. Like, because we've tried to just put in like European style or United States. When I say European or Western, it's kind of, I mean the same into like the Middle East. It didn't work. However, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, they adopted it, but started to add it, fix things to their own cultural traditions.
I see.
Because every culture is different. That's going to play a huge impact. In Asia, these Asian democracies that have done really well are great examples of that. So for the United States, we have not only have an economic interest there, but like in the U.S. Constitution itself, it says we have to promote democracy. That's a duty of our government, and that's something that we should always be trying to push for, because at the end of the day, whether we want to or not, it's either we're going to push democracy, push economic neoliberalism to the world, or China and Russia are going to push authoritarianism and these corrupt, these, I won't even say like, I don't even know, like these corrupt economic systems that don't benefit anyone. They only benefit those in charge. I guess that's the best way to put it.
Yeah, you hear about especially in China, business is like directly fused with government, and so it's crazy, man. You were talking about that the Taiwanese, their whole system, their democracy. How is it different from something like in the U.S. or the U.K.?
Let me give a good example. I wouldn't say, because I'm not as familiar with Taiwan's system, but I'm much more familiar with South Korea, and Japan. So. The first thing is they are parliamentary democracies, so that's very similar to other parts in like United Kingdom, France, Germany, where the head of government, so like for the U.S. the president, and like let's say the Speaker of the House, they're like the same person. So the head of the party would mean they're the head of the government. And that's the first thing. Secondly, that they have a lot of different like mixtures of corporation and economic ideals with the government. So in South Korea, for example, they have these things called chaebols, which chaebols are like family dynasties for business. So, and we all know them: Samsung, LG, Hyundai. These are family-owned companies that are traded on the stock market, and the way the government and corporations, they're not really fused, but like in South Korea, they have what's called the picking winner system. And so the government will go, hey, X, Y, and Z company, we want you to produce microphones. We want you to produce cameras. We want you to produce light bulbs. They'll give heavy subsidies to them in exchange for better working conditions, better X, Y, and Z. While the government still doesn't have ownership, it's still saying, hey, we have control over these subsidies. You do this, we give you this.
It's like a give and take type of thing.
Yeah. The same thing exists in Japan. I can't remember the exact name for it. But like Toyota, for example, they're a chaebol, whatever the Japanese term is for it. As well, their voting systems and kind of like economic duties you have. So you had in the mid-1990s what was known as the Asian financial crisis. We could talk for an hour if I want to explain that. But in short, a lot of Asian currencies crashed because of it, and they weren't as valuable due to a thing called currency pegging, which would mean one currency is directly tied to another. And if I remember correctly, it was because the Chinese yuan was actually pegged to the US dollar for a very long time.
Really?
Yes. And it was taken off to actually devalue the yuan, and that sent a lot of shockwaves and issues. So in South Korea, when this happened, it kind of bankrupted their economy. And the people actually ended up, the South Korean government went to the people of the country and said, can we have some money? Can we have gold? And
really?
They asked, and the people gave them gold. They like bailed out and like fixed their, even everyone listening, imagine Biden or Trump went on TV and said, hey, please pay more in taxes.
People would say, fuck you.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, that would never happen here.
You have to love
you have to
your country. You have to love your government.
You have to pull people's teeth to pay taxes here. Yeah. I'm a Democrat. I don't like paying taxes. Like, nobody
likes paying taxes.
The government asks a lot of these people, like, please pay more. And they, like, it felt like a collective duty. Yeah. Like, it's a way of, like, yeah, they have democracy. It's just a very, it's specific to their culture. It works within their system, their way of life, and how they want to do things. And that's a failure we can see in the Middle East, of where we're just trying to jam the United States, the European way of doing things. Like, no.
That's so interesting. Holy shit. Wow, like you said, nobody in this country would ever pay more taxes. I feel like, I don't know, man. That gives me hope, though. That gives me hope for, like, people coming together and being able to do something for the collective good. Like, if, I don't know about our country, but say like another country was in like an economic hardship like that gives me hope.
I mean, we saw that like in our own country, everyone like kind of wants to forget, I guess, like after 9/11, how many more Americans were willing to give blood, how many more Americans were willing to volunteer, how many more people were joining the military, it was a bad event, but like people at their core, and this is something some may disagree, but I think a majority of people are good at their core. Like, the term for raising a kid, it takes a village. Like, humans were social creatures. We're made to work together. Mm-hmm. We're made to live together. And I think, in part, like with social media and different things, which that's a whole nother topic, but I think we've sort of tried to get away from it in like a consumeristic aspect of hyper focusing on individualism from consumerism. And that's been the issue, where we need to bring back some of the collective, like, we are a community, we are not even a family, but like we've seen family structures kind of devolve. We've seen all these things of like, hey, let's remember we're one group, we're all here together, we live next to each other, we're all on the same team.
Yeah, I feel like the 2 weeks to slow the spread thing, as soon as everybody was on board with that for like a little bit, and like I feel like everybody was like together. You didn't see a lot of people on the road. From being somebody that was cutting grass, like out, like there was nobody on the road. But then whoever started to politicize, whether it was Trump or whoever, all of a sudden it just switched.
Yeah.
And I don't know, man. I feel like
that's actually a great example of the 2 weeks. Like everyone was like, oh shit, there's a virus, no one knows what the fuck is going on.
Yeah,
and like, all right, nothing else matters, guys. Like, let's hold, like, a Republican-controlled House and Senate passed sending $2,000 to every American.
Yeah.
Like, let's think about that. Like, that's insane.
Yeah, because nobody knew how deadly it was.
Yeah.
It was a time of uncertainty for sure. But then we kind of reverted back to this political, one side is that it's just Republican versus Democrat, red versus blue. And I don't know, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I don't know where that exactly started. I mean, obviously you could say Trump, but that's the easy answer. But trying to go deeper, I couldn't find like any other point where that started. As soon as he started attacking the opposition, as soon as he said, if you get an abortion, you deserve to be in jail. Like that kind of started turning the whole wheel of like this one side at the other side. And you still see it today. Driving here, there's a guy running for representative, I forget his name, but the slogan is "Stop the Liberals."
Bill Johnson?
It is Bill Johnson. Okay, and I feel like all these politicians, all these media figures that say, oh, we're so divided, we need to come together, and then they turn around and they do something like that. When you're literally running on, that side of, or that slogan of like, we're against the opposition, I don't agree with that. I don't think that's right. How do you think we get out of that?
I think we get out of it by, I think they're specifically, so I don't think it was Trump. I think it was the Trump era, and specifically the Trump campaign, because there was what's known as Cambridge Analytica. So if you haven't heard of it, it was basically an analytics company that utilized social media to really create echo chambers in a way we've never seen before. And ever since then, it became the way of, oh, we can do this. This makes a way of people to think. Like, if you just, like I said, like the Coca-Cola example of just keep relating things, just keep repeating, that's what they used. They kept using social media trends, and originally it wasn't even Trump, it was Ted Cruz's campaign. Ted Cruz's campaign went to them first. I can't remember the name of the documentary, but just look up Cambridge Analytica, and all the stuff they did for the Trump campaign, and it was all about, hey, we're going to utilize social media. And it's not necessarily to blame them. I mean, any politician wants to win. But after that, it kind of created the trend of, let's use these algorithms to influence people's politics the same way we were starting to use it for marketing products. And since then, that's all that's happened. That's why I think we should regulate big tech. I think we should break up some of these big tech companies, especially like Meta.
That's a scary one.
Yeah, Mark Zuckerberg's gonna send a hitman out for me after this episode. But yeah, like I think like certain things with like these algorithms we see are creating the echo chambers. I think specifically Fox News. I'm not just talking about right wing media, but Fox News specifically in the Murdochs created a trend of like the 24-hour news cycle, which I think is bad. CNN is at fault with that too, but what the Murdochs did was they said, let's let's make news entertainment and make it politically entertaining. And the Murdoch family is very, very right wing.
Right.
So when they did that, they put it out there, and since then they were like one of the fastest growing news channels I believe they're the number one news channel in the United States.
Because they're playing off people's emotions.
Yes. I mean, I'm not like CNN, they're
all bad.
They're guilty of this, but Fox News started this trend of it, and they created the modern model for the 24-hour, we're going to have all this news constantly hitting you, when, let's be honest, you don't need news more than 3 times a day.
Yeah,
you don't need filled in more than.
Like, we already have the internet.
Yeah, we have the internet. Like even a newspaper, read it in the morning. See like what's happening on the other side of the globe only has so much impact on us. Mm-hmm. Like we don't know as much as what's going on around in our local area anymore, but we know much more about what's happening on the other side of the country, which is crazy to think about. Like we've had the death of local news. But we have all this access to other information. I think that's kind of the problem is we have too much information that's too unregulated. Not that the information itself needs regulated, but the way it gets presented almost. Like, hey, you can't just throw X, Y, and Z at every other person. I mean, you have regulations on telecom broadcasts of how much time you're allowed to give a candidate or a campaign to advertise.
Right.
We should kind of have, I think, a system similar for that on the internet.
Makes sense because just advertisements, all these big tech companies profiting off of our data. I mean, that's how they know what to advertise. It's crazy. Wrapping this up, because we do obviously have to wrap it up pretty soon. How do you think we solve this by breaking up the big tech monopolies in terms of this big tech just storing all of our data? How do we get out of that?
I think the way there's 2 ways. So I think whether it's breaking up and regulating the internet and like tech companies and specifically of like, hey, Meta, you can't own every tech company, and then saying, look, for political stuff and also private advertising, we need the FTC to do regulations to say you can't be regulating X, Y, and Z. Like, this person is getting this. You can't do that. Like, specifically with advertising to children, that's been a problem on the internet for a while, but no one's wanted to bring that up.
How so?
I mean, different products. We've had everything from like tobacco products, you can argue, to really just any products that kids are more susceptible to advertising because their brains aren't developed. And there hasn't been like stable regulation for that on the internet as much as you have had, say, like on cable television.
Right.
The second part, I think, is we need a cultural will to do it, and I think honestly after the 2020 election we've been slowly getting there. I think after everyone saw, like, regardless of how you feel on January 6th, I think we kind of came to a precipice of, like, everyone going, holy shit, like, let's take a step back.
Yeah, there's a lot of dumb people out there that can be easily influenced.
Yes, on both sides, and we saw one side finally get that, and it's like people died because of it.
Yes.
Like, we can't do this. Like, we can't keep going down this rabbit hole, and I think people on both sides of the aisle have finally kind of seen, like, hey, let's take a step back. Let's try and figure out what we can do. And I think we've even seen under the current administration steps towards that very, very slowly in their baby steps. But yeah, I think it's those 2 things, a cultural will and also a regulation in the market for how we're doing advertising for both political and private markets. Yeah.
Where can everybody find you on social media? Instagram, TikTok, whatever, Twitter?
You can find me on Instagram at dnapes_. That's DNAPES_. That's really all the social media I have. Maybe I don't know. Maybe I should start something to start talking to myself. I'm not sure. Yeah.
You get a big following, I'm telling you. It's very interesting to talk to.
Thank you.
Even if you had like a minute a day worth of stuff, just like shorts on YouTube or whatever, I think you'd go far. Even like Instagram Reels or some shit like that. Like you're very interesting.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, it was a pleasure to have me on. I love this. Everyone, please follow, repost this. If you're listening to it right now, post it on your damn story. You liked it, you listened to it, give it a like.
Please subscribe as well. We need those subscriptions.
Smash that like button. Smash that shit.
All right. Danny Naples, appreciate you for coming on. Hopefully the podcast gets as big as Nancy Pelosi's tits. Have a good one.
That was a good one. I did like that.